were to drop by and see her or send her an encouragement card, I'm sure that she would appreciate that very much. So for the last 2 weeks, we've been going on a cruise, and we're going to complete our cruise tonight by looking at 2 more ships. First of all, I want to begin with the cruise on the stewardship. So I think it's important for every good steward to understand that stewardship begins with the acknowledgement that all things belong to God. Would we agree with that, that all things belong to God? Yes? And so in order for us to be good stewards, we have to acknowledge that all things do belong to God. And these are the passages that show that indeed all things belong to God. And so I want us to look at those and be reminded of them. And I think it would be a good idea if we would take note and highlight this or whatever it is so that we can know that all things belong to God, because that is a very difficult concept for people to understand, that all things belong to God. Whether you are a Christian or not a Christian, whether you are a believer or not a believer, does not change the fact that all things belong to God. So notice what it says in 1 Chronicles 29 and verse 14. All things come from God. Can it be any plainer than that? All things come from God. And in verse 16 of this chapter, David said, all this abundance that we have provided to build you a house for your holy name, it is from your hand, and all is yours. Do you hear what David is saying? All of the things that was provided to build the house of God was God's in the first place. He says it's from your hand, and all of these belong to you. All of it is yours. In Psalm 50 and verse 10, the passage that we read earlier. For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountains, and everything that moves in the field is mine. He doesn't say some of the things, but he says everything that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine, and all it contains. You hear what he says? The world is mine, and all that it contains is mine. God makes all things, Ecclesiastes 11 verse 5. God made the world and all the things that are in it, Acts 17 and verse 24. Every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift is from God. And so these passages make it abundantly clear that everything belongs to God. All things are God. The world is His and all that it contains. He makes all things. So everything belongs to Him. And so we need to understand when we're thinking about stewardship that what we have, whether it is our home, whether it is our transportation or our mode of transportation or our money, it's God's. It belongs to God. He has just put us in charge of His possessions. That's the idea of being a steward. And so all things belong to God. And we must acknowledge this if we're to be good stewards. And so what does stewardship mean as we talk about the importance of stewardship? Well, the Bible tells us what it means, and so we don't have to come up with our own definition. We're reminded in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 2 that a steward is one that is to be found trustworthy. It's one who is to be found trustworthy. So the first thing we find out about a steward is that he or she has to be trustworthy. Trustworthy of something that belongs to someone else. He is a trustworthy steward. In Luke chapter 12, verses 42 and 44, a steward here is one who is put in charge of another's possessions. He's put in charge of another's possession, and he is faithful in carrying out those responsibilities that have been given him. That's a good steward. That's what stewardship means. But then we see how stewardship plays out in Genesis chapter 39, in verses 3 and 6. Now, we know the story there. We know the story about Joseph and how he became Potiphar's servant. And he became Potiphar's steward. And it says here that he becomes his personal servant. And he, that is Potiphar, made him overseer over his house. and all that he owned he put in his charge. And so you see what the idea of a stewardship. He's been put in charge to be overseer of the house, and all that he owned was put in his charge. That's a steward. Verse 6 says, he left everything he owned. He left everything he owned in Joseph's charge. And he did not worry about anything at all except the food that he would eat. And so Joseph was put in charge of Potiphar's home. He was put in charge of all of his affairs. He looked over it, and Potiphar did not give attention to any of it because he trusted Joseph with all of his possessions. That's the idea of being a steward. So how does that apply to us, being a good steward? Well, I think it's fair to say that God has placed us in charge of that which rightly belongs to him. He's put us in charge of the things that belong to him, and we are to be faithful with the things that he has put us in charge. We are to be faithful managers. We're to be faithful stewards. And so we have the awesome responsibility of managing all of those things that God has given us. We are to be trustees of the gifts that God has given us. And make no mistake about it, God has given us many gifts. He has entrusted us to many things. So let me see if I can illustrate it this way. For those of us who have invested in the stock market or who have invested in 401ks, we have appointed someone to oversee or to manage our investments. And we trust them to manage them well. We trust them to make investments that's going to make money for us. And if we find out that they have not been managing our money very well, then we are going to fire them as being stewards over our investments. The other day I was listening to an interview by Charles Barkley. And if you don't know who Charles Barkley is, he now is a commentator for NBA basketball. And I was watching this video that my son sent me because it was kind of hilarious in the way he accepted his enshrinement into the NBA Hall of Fame. And so this happened about 12 years ago when he was enshrined to the Hall of Fame. And what got my attention is he was giving thanks to all those people who helped make it possible for him to be where he is today. And then he started talking about how thankful he was that he doesn't have to work. He says, I don't ever have to work. I don't like to work. And the reason he doesn't have to work is because he made his money playing basketball and he invested after his NBA career. But then he said, but then my first money manager, I had to fire him because he wasn't managing my money very well. He wasn't investing it the way he was supposed to. You see, he had placed somebody to be a steward over his investments, and that steward failed him. And so he fired him. And so the question is, how are we doing with the things that God has given us? Are we faithful and sensible stewards that Jesus is talking about in Luke chapter 12 and verse 42? So let's look at that entire passage, starting in verse 42 of Luke chapter 12. The Lord said, who then is the faithful and sensible steward, who his master will put in charge of his servants to give them their rations at the proper time? You see what Jesus is saying that the master has done with his steward? He has put him in charge of his servants, that he is to provide for those servants or to give them their rations at that proper time. And he says, blessed is the slave whom his master finds doing so when he comes. And he says, truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. And so he's saying here is a faithful steward who showed himself to be faithful and trustworthy, that he did what his master intended for him to do, to look over his possessions, in this case, to look over his servants, and to provide them the rations that were needed so that these stewards would be able to do the master's work. And because the steward was faithful in carrying out his responsibility, notice that he was blessed and he was put in charge of all the things of the master. That's a faithful steward. But then he says, but if the slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to beat the slave, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and assign him in the place with the unbelievers. And that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of flogging will receive but a few. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required, and to whom he has entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. And so we see here the illustration of a faithful servant or a faithful steward and an unfaithful steward. The unfaithful steward did not do what he was supposed to do. He did not look over the master's affairs the way the master intended him to do it. And because he was not faithful in overseeing the master's affairs, he was punished. He was punished. But the important thing for us to see is, to whom much is given, much is required. Do we get that principle? Has God given us much? He really has. He has given us much, and therefore much is required of us. So I want to remind us in a very practical way that God expects us to be good stewards of His money. He expects us to be good stewards of those possessions that He has given us. Remember, all things belong to God. And so He expects us to be good stewards, and He will hold us accountable of that which belongs to Him. And so we're to use them to bring glory to Him, and if we don't, then He's going to hold us accountable. But if we use those gifts, if we use those possessions that belong to God, if we use them the way we're supposed to, if we show ourselves to be good managers, then God is going to bless us. So let's look at some practical applications of what it means to be a good steward. And I want to begin in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. And what we learn here is a good steward is one who gives God his or her first fruits and not leftovers. Do you hear what I'm saying? A good steward gives God the first fruits and not leftovers. Now, this is the illustration of the poor widow who gave in all that she had to live on. And Jesus commended her and He blessed her for that. She gave everything that she had to live on. She gave her first fruits. So what does that say to us? That we need to give God our very best. We need to give God the first fruits of all that which belongs to us. And in a practical way, when we are setting up a budget, the way I counsel people who are having financial issues in their marriage, I remind them the importance that if you're setting up a budget, the very first thing you need to include in your budget as a line item, if you have a budget and you have line items, the very first thing you need to budget for is your contribution to the Lord. But unfortunately, most people, when I say most people, a lot of people, okay? A lot of people, if they even have a budget, here's the way they budget. First of all, they plan for their mortgage. They plan for their 1 or 2 car payments. They plan for their utilities. They plan for their insurance. They plan for their internet service. They plan for their cable TV. They plan for their cell phones. They plan for entertainment. They plan for the money that they're going to spend eating at the restaurant during the week. They plan for their playtime. And they do all this. And then if they have any money left over, they'll dig in their pocket and see how much they have to give to God on the Lord's day. Now, is that giving the first fruits, or is that giving the leftovers? Well, you know what it is. It's giving what you have left over. But you see, a good steward isn't going to do that. A good steward is going to plan from a budget, and is going to make sure the very first line item in that budget is to give God the first fruits. Give God first, and then all these other things come. Now, let me say this. There's nothing wrong There's nothing wrong with having money to go out for a meal. There's nothing wrong to have money for the internet. There's nothing wrong to have money for a cell phone, to have cable TV or satellite TV. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong to have money for fun time. But not at the expense of giving God first. You get what I'm saying? Okay. So the second thing that we need to understand is not only do we give God the first fruits, but secondly, we need to purpose in our hearts. We need to purpose in our hearts. In other words, we don't give haphazardly. We don't give as an afterthought, but we purpose in our hearts what we're going to give to God. It's planned giving. It's planned giving. And that planned giving means that it's planned in advance. You know, when we set in just a couple of weeks, we're going to be presented with a new budget. Well, in order to meet that budget means that there has to be planned giving. And if this entire church didn't engage in planned giving, then we would really, really struggle to meet the budget. But because there's planned giving from the members of this church, then we're able to meet that budget. Just like there was planned giving to take up that contribution today. And I believe that's the result of that contribution that was taken today, because there were people who planned to give. And so 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7 says, each one must do just as is purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And so notice they purposed in their heart. They planned in their heart what they were going to give to God. And so that planned giving, or that purpose giving, is included in their budget. They know what they're going to give in advance. The next step in being a faithful steward is giving as we prosper. We give as we prosper. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections may be made when I come. And so we can give our first fruits, and we can purposely give, but we can still prosper even if we have a steady income. Most of us have a steady income, and we know what we're going to make week after week or month after month or bi-weekly or whatever. We know what our income is going to be, and from that income, we are able to purpose in our hearts what we're going to give. But there may come a time when we make more than we were expecting to make. For example, some will receive a bonus because of their productivity at work. And so from their bonus, then they're able to give as they prosper, along with what they had already planned to give. Give as you prosper. God prospers us in many ways. And so we understand when we prosper, and we let our stewardship reflect that. And then we're to be ready and generous to share in 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19. Be generous and ready to share. And then, not just with money, but we need to understand a very important principle that's found in Matthew 25, 14 through 30. That we need to be willing to use what God has given us. Whether it's our money, whether it is the mode of transportation we have, whether it is the home that we have, whatever it is, we need to be willing and ready to use what God has given us to His glory. To His glory. And I know that a lot of us have done that. I know that there are those of you who are here who have opened your home and have invited people in to stay in your home when they were traveling and needed a place to stay. I know that there are those of you who have opened your home and have hosted families and fed them a dinner and a meal and what we call hospitality. So you showed hospitality to those and you opened your home to them. Some of you have let others borrow your vehicle because their vehicle has broken down, it's not working, or whatever it is, it's in the shop and they needed transportation. And some of you have allowed people to borrow your vehicle to the glory of God. That is the idea of using what God has given us, using the things that God has given us so that he will be glorified. And so when we look at this passage, we learn the principle that God expects us to use what he has given us. It's the parable of the talents. The 5 talent, the 2 talent, and 1 talent man. The 5 talent used their talents. They were given an additional 5 talents, and they were blessed. The 2 talent man was given an additional 2 talents. He was blessed. The 1 talent man buried his talent, and he lost what he had, and he was punished because he was unfaithful in his stewardship. He's unfaithful in his stewardship. You see, God expects us to use what he has given us. But not only does it apply to material things, but it applies to the spiritual gifts that God has given us as well. And we need to understand that God has given every Christian at least one spiritual gift. Every one of us have a gift from God. Now, we can call it gifts, we can call it talents, we can call it abilities. But I choose to use gifts because that's what the Bible says. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another. You hear what he says? Employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. And so God expects us to use those gifts that he has given us to serve one another. Here's the question. Are we good stewards? And are we using those gifts that God has given us to serve one another? God will hold us accountable. If we believe the Bible and if we believe what stewardship teaches us, then God is going to hold us accountable if we're not using those gifts and serving one another. And so, we need to use what God has given us. If we don't use them, we're going to lose them. And then one more thing with this idea of stewardship. Not only are we to be good stewards of the money that he has given us and the possessions that he has given us and the gifts that he has given us, but we are reminded that we're to be good stewards of his gospel. Good stewards of his gospel. And that's what Paul would say in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. That we're required to be found worthy and we're trustworthy and faithful to the mysteries of God. Do you hear what it says? That it is required of us to be found trustworthy and faithful to the mysteries of God, or the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we need to think about stewardship and the gospel, that we want to invest the gospel in lost souls so that they may be rich in the faith. And the more investment we make, the more we're going to grow, being good stewards with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's our cruise on stewardship. And so let's take one more cruise, and it's on the friendship. One more cruise on the friendship. Who in here would say that friendship's important? I think we would all say it's important to have friends, right? I mean, friendships are really important. I think we would all feel incomplete if we did not have friends. The world would life would just feel not complete if we didn't have friends. And so we all need and we all desire friends. Friends are important to us. With our friends, we can be real. We can be who we really are. With our friends, we can let our hair down. You see how much hair I'm letting down? But really, with our friends, we can be who we are. And we can confide with them. And we can confide our most secret thoughts with them. We can share our pain. We can share our struggles. We can share our hurts. We can share our wounds. And we can share our struggle with sins with them. And know that we have entrusted these things to a faithful friend. We can only do that with friends. You can't do that with somebody who isn't a friend. And we all have friends. Some are closer than others. but nevertheless we have friends. And we like to spend time with our friends. And we like to do things with our friends. And I stand here before you tonight and I tell you my best friend is my wife. And I'd rather spend time with her than anyone else. No offense to any of you. But I'd rather spend time with my wife than anyone else because she's my best friend. And I hope every husband and every wife can say the same thing. I really do. Friendships are important. Proverbs 17, verse 17, a friend loves at all times. Do you hear that? A friend loves at all times. Proverbs 18, verse 24, a man of too many friends comes to ruin. So I guess somebody can have too many friends. But there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. That's a friend. A friend who sticks closer than a brother? There was a time in my life when my brother was my best friend. I mean, he literally was my best friend. We did everything together. We went to school together. We rode the bus together. We rode the same car to school. We double dated. We did everything together, including fighting. We used to fight together, not against one another, but we would fight others together. We did everything together. And then he got married and he went off into the Air Force, and I was absolutely devastated. My life, I felt like it was ruined because I just lost my best friend. A friend who sticks closer than a brother. And when I think of friendship, well, let me ask you this. When you think of friendship in the Bible, who comes to your mind? What? David and Jonathan. You know, they were very good friends. I guess we could say they were best friends. And we read about that friendship in 1 Samuel chapter 19. And here, starting in verse 1, Saul wants his son and his servants to kill David. Saul wants David put to death. And he tells his son, I want you to kill him, and I want the servants, I want all of y'all to put him to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David, it says. And so what does Jonathan do? He intervenes for David, and he starts talking to his father, Saul, and he pleads with him, and he reminds him what David had done for him and for the children of Israel. And ultimately, he talks his father out of putting David to death. And so it says that in verse 7 that Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all of these words, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly. You see, Jonathan was willing to stand up to his dad if that would spare his friend David. And then a sad conclusion of this friendship was in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and starting in verse 11. When David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and also did all the men who were with him, and they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for all the people of the Lord in the house of Israel, because they had fallen on the sword. David was devastated when he lost his best friend, Jonathan. Have you ever lost a good friend? It's painful. No one wants to lose a friend. I remember the sorrow I had when a friend of mine was killed in 1981. 25 years old, or thereabout, leaving behind a wife and a 1-year-old son. We love our friends, but I think it's safe to say that the best thing for us, better than even having a friend, is to being a friend of God. And we all want to be friends of God, don't we? And we can be that friend of God with an obedient faith. Not only are we going to be a child of God, not only are we going to be a Christian, not only are we going to be a faithful servant, but with an obedient faith, we're friends with God. And I know that's so because we are reminded of that, about the friendship that it says of Abraham. It says there that he believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. He believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteous. Why was he found righteous? Because not only did he believe, but he obeyed God. And so he was called that friend of God. You remember when Jesus was in his ministry, one of the things that they used to say about him, that he was friends with tax collectors and who? Sinners. I'm glad that he was a friend with sinners, because you know what? I'm a sinner. And I think every one of us in here would say, yeah, we too are sinners. And I'm glad that Jesus is my friend. And we know that Jesus is his friend because he laid down his life for us. While we were still helpless at the right time, Christ died for us. We're friends with Jesus because we are sinners. What a friend we have in Jesus. What a friend we have in Jesus. I think we have a song there, don't we? What a friend we have in Jesus, right? And because he is our friend and Savior, we can take everything to him in prayer. It doesn't matter what it is. We can confide in our friend Jesus. We can tell him what's on our heart. We can tell him what's troubling us. We can tell him what's paining us. It doesn't matter because we have that friend in Jesus. And here's the good news. Jesus will never, ever disappoint us. He will never disappoint us. Have you ever been disappointed by a friend? I have. And I'm quite confident that I probably have disappointed some of my friends. And for that I apologize. Because we are human. And humans are going to mess up. They're going to make mistakes. And they are going to disappoint. But let me tell you one thing. And you can take it to the bank. You can count on it. Jesus is never going to disappoint you. It doesn't matter. He will never disappoint you. You may disappoint him. I may disappoint him. And we have disappointed him. But he will never disappoint us. That's our friend Jesus. And I'm thankful that he will never disappoint us. And because God is our friend, because Jesus is our friend, then we can be friends with one another unlike any other friend. It is a true saying, a friend who is a friend in the Lord is a friend forever. Do you hear that? A friend who is a friend in the Lord is a friend forever. That's true. Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I've loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. Love one another." That's friendship. I am thankful that you are my friends. If you need to respond tonight, we want to give you an opportunity. If you have a need, and if you think that we can help you with that, please don't be afraid to let us know. If you'd like for us to pray for you, we'd be glad to do so once you come while we stand and sing.
Without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come.